Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to take a slightly different look at some of these questions. Our probability panel, which we've been developing in Canada for the last 17 years, initially we were using live caddy as our sampling frame. We did random experiments and found that we could get nearly identical results using IVR, which, unlike in the United States, is not limited in terms of reach. So it's another approach. But I would like to talk about not just the problems that confront us in terms of dealing with challenging demographics, which we know is a huge problem. In Canada, we have a huge problem representing new Canadians, younger Canadians, economically vulnerable and so forth. But I want to talk about something which might be at least as big a challenge, in some respects more difficult, which is how do you represent people who are institutionally mistrustful, which is increasingly connected to people who exhibit high levels of misinformation, which in many cases is a product of conscious disinformation, which is being served up to them in ways that we hadn't seen in the past, and increasingly driven by more sophisticated algorithms and AI and so forth. So I'm just going to, if I could, go through in the next 10 minutes some of the highlights of what we've been finding. Just by context, we started polling at the beginning of the pandemic in Canada. I was a member of a task force looking at vaccine hesitancy and take-up. And in that, it's evolved into other areas since then, but we have conducted 52 waves using our probability panel with a lot of capacity to do both repeated measures and to do sort of the cross-sectional. One of the issues which has come out as extraordinarily important is the impacts of both mistrust and disinformation, which seem to be linked to unprecedented levels of polarization, which is by no means unique to Canada, but Canada is by no means exempt. We find that the people who exhibit these levels of mistrust and disinformation are dramatically more likely to hold skewed views of the economy, not skewed, just flawed, spurious views of the economy. We also find, for example, in Canada, in Washington, you had your January 6th, we had an occupation of our nation's capital, which went on for 3 weeks, called the Freedom Convoy. We found, for example, that people who were fully informed in our testing, which was based on some basic literacy questions, which are asked in other countries as well, that sympathy with the convoy was about 3%. And as we moved up each ladder of the disinformation index to the most disinformed, it rose to 98%. So these are effects of not just 10 or 20%, they're 20 and 30 time-fold effects. And we find similar relationships between institutional mistrust, which is not just connect to things like sympathy for the Freedom Convoy, which, as we'll see in this presentation, is directly linked to the incidence of people who take vaccines or have negative attitudes to vaccines, which we find is a useful proxy for understanding whether we're representing institutional trust, because unlike for demographics, where we have a convenient census to measure things against, we don't have population parameter measures of this. But we find, because the correlations are so tightly interwoven with vaccines, that it can provide a useful proxy for understanding. So I'm going to go through and just show you quickly some of the connections between disinformation, and the annex shows how we measured it. But you can see that people who exhibited very low levels of disinformation were considerably more likely to think that the economy was improving. Whereas if you move down to those who are the most disinformed, you see the monotonic progression from 10 to 57% who think that interest rates are continuing to rise, whereas in fact they're half the levels they were a year ago. But this applies to a myriad of other indicators as well, including climate change, outlook on the war in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So it's very challenging when you see this burgeoning level of polarization fueled by disinformation, mistrust, and what we call ordered populism. Here's another indicator. You can see that the support for the Freedom Convoy in Canada is almost non-existent for those, and it's about half of Canadians who got all the questions right. And then it rises dramatically and progressively in a straight line function to almost everybody being sympathetic. So you can see it's substantively very important. So are we sure that we're covering that off accurately in the survey? And what we found, and I'm going to go, I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'd urge you to look at these more carefully later. But I want to show you that at the beginning of the pandemic, this is our tracking of the stated intentions and behavior of the sample and actual behavior, which was recorded officially in very careful fashion. And you can see that we had, unlike a lot of the opt-in panels, we had actually a very tight convergence, which was also true in research in the United States and elsewhere. You can see that convergence starts to break down later on as we got into more doses and beyond the initial 2 doses. But let me just show you a couple of these indicators which show that the tight correspondence that we saw in the early stages of vaccine rollout, which was very successful in Canada, 90% of adults received at least 2 vaccines, broke down after the mandates were removed and after disinformation started becoming a more potent source. And we saw that we were getting systematically higher levels of dropout in our panel from those who had exhibited disinformation and were less likely to have gone on and accepted more than the 2 mandated vaccines. So it provided an interesting opportunity to test this. I'm just going to show you and there was certainly demographic correlates, the overrepresentation of institutionally mistrustful, which mirrored those who were less likely to go on and get more than 2 vaccines or to get any vaccines at all, was overstated amongst men, particularly those under 50, non-university educated, and those who exhibited high levels of disinformation. And it was linked extremely tightly. Here, just a quick example. In the early stages of the pandemic, this is the initial rollout of people who got 2 vaccines, which was the mandated number, which reached an actual number of 90%. And this is our survey estimate. You can see it's 90%, pretty darn good. But what you can see as well, that as time goes on, that starts breaking down. We start getting a little more indication of people, rather than what the population numbers were, who had had 3 or more doses, and an underrepresentation of those who had had 2 doses. And we've attributed that in some of our analysis to the impacts of disinformation and mistrust. We also went in to look at repeated measures analysis and found out that we were getting differential turnout, that some of the more mistrustful under repeated interviews and conditioning effects were typically benign, but at a certain point, we reached a tipping point. They were more likely to drop out of the panel. And so it wasn't that it was a measurement effect. We found that there was a systematic higher attrition rate for institutionally mistrustful, which produced this idea. And you can see the connections between whether you accepted vaccines and, for example, in this case, trust. You can see that the incidence is dramatic with very high trust, almost all of them getting vaccinated, and almost, the vast majority not getting vaccinated as you moved up that ladder of disinformation and mistrust. The same effects for disinformation, very, very strong effects, as you can see. So you want to have this substantively. You also want to have this available methodologically. You want to make sure. Now, what we found is that we could make adjustments because, for example, we found that the incidence of people who had received and stopped at 2 vaccines is about 31% for adults in Canada. It was getting reported about 20%. So adjusting and using raking with other kinds of factors, we could come up with a pretty reasonable estimate, which would get us something which would restore the incidence of those people in our sample. But obviously that's just a short-term adjustment. Going forward, we're now exploring methods for going back and trying to activate people with those characteristics using different types of inducements and different types of survey invitations to see if we can, in fact, get a more permanent solution, which is to have an adequate representation of these crucial groups of the disinformed and mistrustful. So in conclusion, these are extraordinarily powerful predictors of polarization and populism, are probably the biggest problems confronting advanced Western democracies. And so having them measured accurately and having them represented with scientific accuracy in our surveys and panels is critical. So that's a quick tour of what we were finding. I have a little more information in our annex about how we measured some of these things, but I would be glad to answer any questions. Anyway, that's I'm not going to go through that right now. So I know we're short on time and lunch is beckoning. So I hope I've told you a few things that you found helpful or provocative, and I will be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.